The mansion at Akoi buzzed with morning activity as Chief Damien's convoy rolled out of the compound. The security men saluted, the chef bowed, and the maids adjusted their aprons as the boss's car disappeared into the distance. Inside, Ngozi stood by the marble staircase in a floral silk wrapper, her Bible clutched against her chest. Her voice had been soft and holy all morning, peppered with "in Jesus' name" and "thank you, my king," as she saw off her husband. But the moment the gate clanged shut, her expression darkened like nightfall. She turned slowly toward Chidinma, who was standing nervously by the dining table, still wearing her faded school uniform from the previous day, her satchel clutched to her chest. Ngozi's lips curled. Without warning, she walked over and slapped the girl hard across the face. "You didn't kneel well enough this morning. You want to provoke me?" she hissed. Chidinma staggered, holding her cheek, but she said nothing. She'd learned silence was safer than speaking. Ngozi stood tall, inspecting her own perfectly polished nails like she hadn't just hit a child. "Let today be the last time I remind you what kneeling means in this house," she said coolly. "You think because your mother gave birth to you first, you're entitled to this family? You're wrong. The day your father dies, you die too." Her words were not just cruel, they were deliberate. Every line was carved to break Chidinma's spirit, not just her skin. The girl trembled, her voice caught in her throat, but Ngozi was not done. She picked up the breakfast Chidinma had cooked earlier and flung the plate to the floor. "Is this burnt yam what I'll eat? Eat it yourself. Starve, like your useless mother did." Chidinma crouched quietly to clean the shards while Ngozi's voice echoed. "You should thank me every day. If not for me, your father would have sent you to the village long ago." Upstairs, Obinna, the golden boy, laughed from his room. He'd heard it all. He always did. Later that evening, when Chief Damien returned, the house transformed again. Ngozi met him at the door, smiling like an angel. She helped him remove his shoes, kissed his cheek, and fanned him gently while saying, "Your food is hot and ready, my king." Chidinma came downstairs to greet him, her cheeks still red from the slap, but before she could talk, Ngozi cut in. "Honey, she fell while rushing to iron your clothes. I've told her not to run around." Damien chuckled and waved it off. "You see this girl? Always clumsy." Chidinma's mouth remained open for a second too long, but she lowered her gaze and nodded slowly. Her father's love had long shifted to Ngozi, the woman who wore holiness like perfume. But behind the closed doors of that mansion, there was no heaven, only hell, decorated in marble, silence, and secrets. In the privacy of her bedroom, Ngozi held a family portrait in her hands. She stared at it for a long moment, Damien in the middle, Chidinma on one side, Obinna on the other. Slowly, she removed the glass frame, slid out the photo, and used a razor blade to cut Chidinma's face out of it. She smiled. "That's better." She called her son Obinna into the room and showed him what she'd done. The teenage boy, already arrogant with entitlement, chuckled. "Mummy, that girl doesn't belong here." Ngozi nodded approvingly. "Say it again. She's not your sister. She's a parasite. Your father may not know now, but one day, he will sign everything to you. Not to that thing." Obinna beamed as she ruffled his hair. "You're the heir. The only child that matters." Outside, Chidinma sat on the cold tiles in the corridor with her schoolbooks. Her lips moved quietly as she tried to read, but her eyes were swollen. Obinna kicked her book aside as he walked past. "You still day read? You ain't go end up as housegirl." She didn't reply. He yanked her school bag, emptied it on the floor, and scattered her notes. Ngozi appeared from nowhere, pretending to be surprised. "Obinna, why are you disturbing your sister?" she asked loudly for the benefit of the passing maid. But when the maid turned the corner, Ngozi whispered coldly, "Next time you open your mouth to speak back, I will pour hot water on you." Chidinma packed her books without a word. She wanted to scream, to ask God why she was born into this hell. But the house was too big and her voice too small. Later that week, Chief Damien called Chidinma into his study. "Your school fees are becoming too much," he said sternly. "Your stepmother says you've been wasting money." Chidinma's heart dropped. "Daddy, it's not true." "Shut up," he snapped. "Don't argue with your mother. I've reduced your pocket money." Use it wisely. She stood there, crushed, wondering how to explain that Ngozi had been stealing from her purse and blaming her for it. But her father's mind was made up. As she left the study, she passed Ngozi in the hallway. The woman leaned close and whispered, "You see? I don't have to lift a finger to destroy you. I just speak and you drown." Chidinma kept walking. The silence in her throat was no longer fear, it was survival. The compound was filled with Christian women in brightly colored wrappers and geli. They danced and clapped in the name of Jesus as Ngozi led worship in the living room. "Let us thank the Lord for the fruit of the womb, for obedient children, and for peace in our homes," she sang, with eyes closed and arms lifted high. Everyone echoed amen and praised her spiritual maturity. Chidinma stood awkwardly at the corner, serving juice and chin-chin. One of the women pinched her cheek, playfully. "Ngozi, this your daughter fine-o. So quiet and respectful." Ngozi beamed like a saint. "She's my gift from God. I treat her like my own." Everyone applauded. But inside, Chidinma's hands were trembling. She had served them juice with fingers that still bore fresh cane marks from that morning's punishment. Once the women left, Ngozi's demeanor shifted like a mask falling off. "Rubbish girl. Who asked you to smile at them like a saint?" She dragged Chidinma by her blouse and slapped her across the face. Once, twice. "You used my charger this morning, didn't you? You think I didn't notice?" Chidinma tried to explain, but Ngozi cut her off with another slap and kicked her shin. "One day I'll break your legs. That's when you'll learn your place." Obinna watched from the stairway, grinning. To him, Chidinma's pain was entertainment. The girl lay on the floor in silence, her face bleeding slightly from the corner of her mouth. There were no tears left to cry. That night, as she rubbed balm on her swollen face, Chidinma approached her father. She stood beside his armchair while he watched the news. "Daddy, please can I go back to boarding school?" she asked softly. Damien turned. "What's wrong with living at home?" She hesitated. "Mummy, she beats me." He frowned. "Your mother?" "Ngozi." Chidinma nodded, slowly. He burst into laughter. "That woman? She can't even kill a fly." "She tried again. She hit me today." Damien stood, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Don't ever speak ill of your mother again. She loves you." Chidinma stood frozen as he walked away. It was in that moment she realized she was truly alone. The house became a theater of invisible knives. Ngozi no longer shouted or slapped openly. She learned to kill Chidinma slowly, through silence, starvation, and sabotage. She would wait until Chief Damien left for work, then switch off the water pump, forcing Chidinma to fetch water with buckets from the next compound. If she delayed or missed school, she blamed her laziness. She would purposely tear Chidinma's uniform at the seam, then claim the girl was careless. When food was served, Ngozi would give her the burnt part of the yam or the thinnest akara ball, watching her eat from a distance like a hunter watching prey. Every kindness Ngozi showed to others was a performance. But to Chidinma, her wickedness was precise and daily, 1,000 little cuts that never drew blood but drained the soul. Obinna joined in with glee. He would lock Chidinma in the toilet, pour water on her mattress, and once even loosened the brakes on her bicycle just to watch her fall. She returned one evening with bruises and her school bag torn, and Ngozi only sighed. "You're cursed. That's why everything follows you." When Chidinma tried to explain, Ngozi said nothing, until the next day, when she told Damien that Chidinma had joined a secret cult in school and was fighting. Her father, who no longer questioned anything his wife said, called the girl in and slapped her across the face, warning her to never disgrace his name again. That night, as Chidinma lay on her mattress with mosquito bites decorating her arms, she whispered to herself, "I'm not mad. I know what I'm going through. One day, I will leave this house alive, or I will be carried out dead." The worst came the night the necklace went missing. It was Ngozi's most expensive gold chain, a wedding anniversary gift from Damien. She screamed and called for all the maids. Then she accused Chidinma. "I saw you in my room yesterday. Where is it?" Chidinma's knees trembled. "I didn't enter your room." Ngozi slapped her. "Liar. How can it just vanish?" She summoned Damien. "Your daughter is a thief," she cried with practiced tears. Chidinma kept denying it, but Damien didn't wait. He flogged her with a belt, each strike powered by blind trust in his wife. The next morning, the necklace was found under Ngozi's bed, where she had hidden it herself. But she said nothing. Instead, she hissed, "It doesn't change the fact that you could have stolen it. I don't trust you. You're like your dead mother, a disgrace." Chidinma stared at her. A part of her heart died. But another part, the part she never knew existed, began to burn. December arrived with dusty harmattan winds and the fake smiles of holiday traditions. Damien announced a surprise. The family would travel by train to their ancestral village in Imo State. Chidinma, who hadn't seen her grandmother's compound in 6 years, lit up for the first time. She ran upstairs to pack her warm wrapper and school shoes, even humming as she arranged her things. Ngozi watched her from the hallway with a chilling stillness. She hadn't expected Chidinma to be excited. She had assumed the girl would be miserable. But now, watching her smile, something inside Ngozi boiled. The idea that the girl still had joy, after all the beatings, accusations, and starvation, angered her more than anything else. That night, as Damien snored beside her, she stood in front of the mirror in her silk nightgown and whispered, "Tonight is the last time that rat will breathe." She opened her drawer and packed her gloves. The train station was crowded the next day. Hawkers screamed, passengers scrambled, and conductors shouted directions over loudspeakers. Damien bought first-class tickets. The family boarded early, and Chidinma sat beside the window, watching children run along the platform and imagining herself free, just for a day. Obina plugged his ears with AirPods and ignored her. Ngozi wore a gold wrapper and sunglasses, adjusting her scarf as if paparazzi would appear any minute. Halfway through the journey, Damien excused himself to speak to a political associate in another coach. Ngozi saw her chance. "Chidinma, come with me. I want to take pictures near the last coach. The view there is better," she said sweetly. Chidinma hesitated. It felt strange, but obeyed. They walked toward the last cabin. Ngozi glanced around. No one followed. The corridor was narrow. The door at the end led to the metal coupling between coaches, a dangerous spot. Ngozi opened the door and stepped out onto the small platform. "Stand here," she said. Chidinma stood there nervously, gripping the rail. The train sped through tall grasslands and valleys. Ngozi turned to her slowly, smiling. "Take one last look at this world." Chidinma frowned. "Ma." Ngozi's eyes turned to fire. She suddenly shoved Chidinma hard in the stomach. The girl gasped. Her body stumbled backward. She tried to grab the rail, but her fingers missed. The world spun. The last thing she saw was Ngozi's satisfied smirk. Then her body flew off the train. The wind screamed louder than she ever could. She hit the slope with a dull, deadly thud and tumbled into thick bushes. Back on the train, Ngozi calmly closed the door, smoothed her scarf, and walked back inside. She let out a scream. "My daughter fell. Jesus. My daughter fell." The search was chaotic. The train was stopped. Staff and passengers rushed out. The driver radioed ahead. Ngozi wailed like a banshee, collapsing on the floor, calling out God's name. "She was standing with me. I don't know what happened." Damien clutched his chest in horror, shouting orders. Obina stood to the side, pretending to panic. For 2 hours, local police and villagers combed the area. But it was a steep terrain, bushy, wild, dangerous. They found nothing. No blood. No body. Just broken branches and a torn handkerchief. Eventually, they gave up. "She must have rolled deep into the gorge," one officer said. Damien sat on a rock and wept. Ngozi knelt beside him, holding his hand, saying, "God gives. God takes. We must bury her with dignity." No one suspected her. She cried too well. But Chidinma wasn't dead. She had landed on a bed of grass and rolled down the hill, hitting rocks and roots, losing consciousness. When she awoke, it was night. Her body ached. Her head throbbed. Her mouth tasted of blood. She couldn't speak. She couldn't scream. She dragged herself until she passed out again. The next morning, A deaf hunter named Papa Ikena found her while checking his traps. He lifted her frail, broken body and carried her to his wife. They nursed her with herbs, fed her warm soup, and bandaged her wounds. She couldn't talk for 2 weeks. They didn't know who she was, only that she was a miracle. She stayed in the village, using hand gestures to communicate, hiding from the world. She didn't want to go back. She wasn't sure if she was even supposed to be alive. In Lagos, the funeral was swift. Ngozi wore black lace and dark sunglasses. She wailed louder than anyone. "My daughter. My baby," she cried before cameras. Damien was broken. Obinna pretended to comfort him. Inside the mansion, the maids whispered, "That girl's ghost go torment madam." But Ngozi heard them and smiled. That night, she entered her room, closed the curtains, and opened a bottle of wine. She toasted to herself in the mirror. "No more competition," she whispered. "My son is now the only heir." But somewhere far from that mansion, deep in a forest hut, a girl lay on a mat with bandaged arms and stitched lips. A ghost still breathing. Chidinma's second chance at life began not in a hospital, but in a mud brick hut deep in the forest of Ominato village, far away from the flashing lights of Lagos. The old hunter, Papa Ikena, who had no children of his own, carried her bleeding body into the hut without asking questions. His wife, Mama Ifeoma, gasped when she saw the state of the girl: torn uniform, one shoe, cracked lips, bruises on her thighs and collarbone, and blood trickling from her nose. They didn't recognize her, but something about the way she clung to life moved them. "This child was thrown away like a chicken feather," Mama Ifeoma whispered. The old couple nursed her back to consciousness using herbs, steam, and bitter leaf water. Days passed. Her eyes opened, but she couldn't speak. The trauma had stolen her voice. She would cry in her sleep, screaming without sound. She would wake and touch her throat in confusion, unable to tell them what had happened or who she was. But Mama Ifeoma always repeated, "God didn't save you for nothing." Though her voice was gone, her mind was alive. Each passing day stitched her wounds and sharpened her memories. She remembered the train, Ngozi's voice, the fall, the darkness. It came back to her like thunder after lightning. The betrayal, the slap, the lies. The look on Ngozi's face before she pushed her, calm, cruel, victorious. Rage grew slowly in Chidinma's soul. She wasn't just hurt, she was erased. Buried without a body. Mourned by murderers. While she healed, she began to learn the way of the village. Cooking over firewood, weaving mats, pounding yam, and even helping Papa Ikena set traps in the forest. The villagers, though curious, accepted her quietness as humility. A local priest who visited the village recognized her face from a missing poster at a train station weeks before. He gently asked her name. She shook her head. He asked again, but she looked away. She didn't want to be found. Not yet. The world that threw her away wasn't ready for her return. She stayed in the village for over a year. Her voice slowly returned in whispers, though it cracked when she tried to speak fast. But in her silence, she learned strength. She watched people, listened deeply, and for the first time in her life, she began to dream without fear. Mama Ifeoma taught her tailoring, and soon Chidinma was making simple skirts and blouses for village women. She sold them for small coins, saving every kobo. With the help of a local priest, she began to read again, this time books on business, strategy, and survival. She no longer saw herself as a victim. In fact, she didn't even call herself Chidinma anymore. One night, she stood by the river and whispered a new name, C.D. Okoye. Not the girl who was pushed off the train, but the woman who would one day return with thunder in her voice and a storm in her hands. In Lagos, the mansion was quiet but heavy with manufactured grief. The funeral ceremony for Chidinma became more of a PR show than a sacred farewell. Ngozi wore flowing black lace with diamond-studded heels and carried a lace handkerchief she dabbed constantly against her dry eyes. She cried so perfectly that everyone believed she was broken. Mourners filled the compound, whispering about how sweet Chidinma was. So respectful, one guest said. She must have slipped, another whispered. Damien sat motionless in the front row like a carved statue, his eyes swollen from tears. But he didn't cry for Chidinma. Not fully. He cried because he sensed, deep in his chest, that something didn't make sense. But he was too broken to challenge it. Obinna moved through the crowd like a prince receiving condolences. "My sister's death broke us," he told people. Ngozi nodded beside him. But every time she went into the house, away from the crowd, she smiled into the mirror and whispered, "One down." The only oddity that day was one of the older maids, MMA Aduak, who had served the family for over 15 years. She had always loved Chidinma and had suspected Ngozi's cruelty. As she watched Ngozi dance dramatically beside the coffin, she shook her head. "God is not sleeping," she murmured. That evening, when most people had left and only close relatives remained, MMA Aduak cornered Ngozi in the kitchen. "Madam, how come that girl fell?" "Was she alone?" she asked carefully. Ngozi turned slowly, her face dropping its mask. "Are you suggesting something, Aduak?" The old woman swallowed. "No, but I served this house too long to not know when something is not right." That same night, MMA Aduak fell violently ill. The doctor said it was food poisoning. She didn't die, but she left the compound the next morning, quietly, with a small nylon bag and a face full of fear. Ngozi had ensured no one stood in her way. As weeks passed, the family dynamic changed. Obinna began to feel like a king. His mother started showing him bank account statements, documents, property titles. "This will all be yours," she told him. Damien, though grieving, was growing weaker and distracted. Ngozi prepared his food, gave him pills, and arranged his bed. She fed him like a wife who cared. But every time she wiped his mouth, she thought of how easy it would be to silence him next. "He's too sentimental," she muttered once to herself, always pitying that girl. In the drawing room, Chidinma's portrait remained on the wall. Ngozi told everyone it was for remembrance. But at night, she stood in front of it with a candle, looked at the girl's eyes, and whispered, "You should have died properly. I don't like unfinished business." But the wind outside the window howled, almost like a whisper from the dead. Far away from the false mourning and poisoned goodbyes, the girl Ngozi thought was dead was blossoming in the most unexpected place. Chidinma, now going by CD, was no longer afraid of her past. She had stopped flinching in her sleep. Her voice, once stolen by fear, now returned in full sentences. She kept it low, controlled. When she spoke, it was with purpose. Mama Ifioma continued teaching her tailoring, and soon CD was making gowns for village weddings. She became known as the silent designer. With her little income, she bought a second-hand phone from a traveling trader and used the priest's Wi-Fi to enroll in online business classes. Nobody in the village suspected she had once lived in a mansion in Lagos. She was just a quiet girl with sharp eyes and steady hands. But deep down, every stitch she made, every kobo she saved, every skill she learned, was a brick in the empire she was building in silence. Her turning point came when a young donor from a foreign NGO visited Ominato to fund youth initiatives. He noticed her during a village tailoring exhibition and asked who taught her. She smiled and simply said, "Life did." Impressed by her work ethic, he asked to sponsor her with a business grant. She accepted under her new identity. CD Okoye, she wrote on the form. The money wasn't much, but it allowed her to buy a laptop, printer, and better sewing machine. At night, while others slept, she wrote business plans, downloaded stock market PDFs, watched interviews with Nigerian female CEOs. She studied Ngozi from afar, not through tears this time, but through strategy. She found out who Damien's company board members were. She traced shareholders. She followed every paper trail. She wanted not just revenge. She wanted to dismantle them completely. Not by shouting, not by accusing, but by owning everything they thought she'd never touch. In a small notebook she kept under her mattress, she wrote one line every morning: "I am not the dead girl. I am the ghost that will build a throne." Years passed. She grew stronger, smarter, harder. She kept her scars hidden. She laughed only when necessary. She forgave no one. Her eyes had seen what love looked like when it wore the face of death. She trusted no one, not even herself fully. But she believed in one truth. Ngozi thought she had buried her. But she had only planted her. And soon, she would grow into something Ngozi could never destroy again. 10 years had passed since that fateful train journey. 10 long years of silence, healing, learning, and strategizing. Now 26 and no longer the broken girl Ngozi had tried to erase, Chidinma, now fully reborn as Dr. C.D. Okoye, sat behind the tinted glass of a luxury SUV, looking at the towering structure in Victoria Island that once bore her father's name. Damien Holdings, once a family empire, now drowning under Obina's reckless management and Ngozi's lavish corruption. But what no one knew was that for the past 18 months, CD had been acquiring silent shares in the company. Using a shell firm registered under a foreign trust, she had legally and quietly purchased 40% of the company's equity. The chaos she witnessed from afar was not coincidental. It was orchestrated. She had built relationships with foreign investors, posed as a Dubai-based energy investor, and sat on Zoom calls disguised by corporate veils. The same company that had once ignored her name now unknowingly bowed to her shadow. She never forgot the pain, but she no longer acted from emotion. Revenge wasn't about slapping her enemies in public. It was about ensuring they never recovered after the fall. Chidinma worked with a team of 3, her loyal lawyer Chuka, her IT wizard Sandra, and a financial consultant named Mr. Daipo, all unaware of her past but loyal to her goals. Through their help, she had gained influence over 3 out of the 5 board members at Damien Holdings. She discovered that Obina had used the company to borrow over 500 million Nigerian nairas from creditors, money he laundered through fake contractors and flashy purchases, including luxury cars and parties in South Africa. Ngozi, on her part, had redirected charity funds into personal properties in Banana Island. But what truly enraged Chidinma wasn't the greed. It was that they had flourished off the blood of her silence. She had lived in mud huts while they dined with senators. But the days of luxury were ending, and none of them even saw it coming. In one decisive move, CD initiated a boardroom vote to suspend all disbursements of profits and restructure debt servicing plans. Obina was blindsided. Banks began to call. Projects were frozen. Ngozi's personal assistant resigned mysteriously after receiving a legal threat tied to forged documents. Like termites, the damage spread fast and quietly. Chidinma sat in her high-rise apartment, sipping zobo from a crystal glass, watching the empire buckle under her fingertips. The mansion in Ikoyi, once untouchable, now carried the weight of debt and secrets. And she hadn't even shown her face yet. Not once. Her name wasn't in any newspaper. Her voice hadn't echoed in courtrooms. She was a ghost, and that was exactly how she planned it. The train didn't kill me, she thought. It transformed me. And now, it was time to unearth the footage that would bring the entire house of lies crashing down. Retrieving the train footage wasn't easy, but Chidinma had learned how to navigate the bureaucracy of public institutions. Through Chuka, her lawyer, she bribed a senior NTA archivist who had once handled transport coverage for Federal Railway Services. At first, the woman denied any such footage could still exist. 10 years is too long, she said. But Sandra, the tech expert, insisted that railway security footage was kept for legal liability reasons and could be retrieved if the right servers were accessed. They traced the old security company that handled logistics for the train that day and filed a confidential retrieval request under the guise of an ongoing litigation matter. Weeks passed. The wait was long and nerve-wracking. But one rainy Thursday afternoon, Chidinma got a call. "We found something," Chuka whispered. "It's raw, blurry, but it's there." She rushed to the office. What she saw chilled her to the bone, not because she didn't remember it, but because it was even colder than she recalled. There it was, black and white footage, showing 2 women stepping out of a last coach. One older, in a scarf. One younger, clearly nervous. The camera had no audio, but it didn't need sound. It captured Ngozi's face perfectly, calm, smiling, and then a sudden motion, her hand hitting Chidinma's stomach. The girl stumbled. Her arms flailed. Then gone. The video ended just before the girl's body disappeared from view. It wasn't cinematic, but it was enough. Enough to prove Ngozi had lied. Enough to reopen a case. Chidinma sat frozen. The tape made it real. She wasn't just imagining her trauma anymore. It was recorded. Cold. Silent. Undeniable. "We wait," she said quietly. "Not yet. When I show this, it'll be the last nail in the coffin." But it wasn't just about that footage. As Sandra continued her investigation, she found something else. A suspicious hospital report from 10 years ago. A maid in Damien's house had reportedly died of sudden food poisoning. The victim? MMA Uduak, the only person who once dared question Ngozi. Chidinma's heart sank. She remembered Uduak, the only woman who ever tried to protect her. Her death had been sudden and mysterious. Sandra dug deeper and contacted a cousin of the woman. They had quietly kept her hair samples from the burial for personal reasons. Chuka arranged for forensic testing. The results came in. Traces of rat poison and a neurotoxin not typically found in household food. The coroner's conclusion: intentional poisoning. It all clicked. Ngozi hadn't just tried to kill her. She'd succeeded with someone else, and maybe even more. The case now shifted from personal revenge to criminal homicide. Chidinma's hands trembled as she held the two pieces of evidence: the footage from the train and the toxicology report from Uduak's death. "You didn't just push me, Ngozi. You've been murdering in silence for years. And now, I'm the silence coming to bury you." It began with a freeze, not of temperature, but of assets. One Friday morning, Obinna walked into the Damien Holdings office only to find his biometric access denied. The system had locked him out. In a panic, he called the board secretary, only to be told that an emergency shareholder vote had stripped him of his operational control. "You didn't show up for the audit review," the secretary said blandly. "The shareholders are reassigning control." He ran to his mother. Ngozi was livid. She called her lawyer. But at the same moment, a fresh petition had been submitted to the EFCC by a silent shareholder, under the alias Okoye Global Partners. Attached were forged contractor receipts, dummy account transfers, and tax evasion documents tied directly to Ngozi and her son. The EFCC began investigating. Within 72 hours, 3 of their major accounts were frozen. Panic set in. Ngozi screamed in her room, throwing her handbag at the wall. Who is this investor? Who is sabotaging us? Damien, now old, partially paralyzed, and barely speaking, noticed the tension. He asked for an update, but Ngozi gave him sleeping pills to help him rest. His eyes, though weak, sensed the truth. He asked one of the guards to bring him a priest. The man confessed, "Sir, there's something wrong. Madam is hiding things." But before the priest could return the next day, Damien was gone. He didn't wake up from his sleep. Ngozi cried for the world to see. A newspaper article praised her loyalty as a devoted widow. But behind closed doors, Chidinma, watching from afar, received the autopsy report through her lawyer. Traces of double sedation in Damien's blood, far above the required prescription. Enough to classify it as potential euthanasia. A second murder, wrapped in a motherly disguise. But Chidinma didn't publish anything yet. She waited. Carefully. Calmly. With one hand, she pulled strings that caused contracts to collapse, properties to be seized, and staff to resign. Ngozi sold her jewelry to fund Obinna's bail after the EFCC arrested him over 100 million Nigerian nairas in illegal contracts. The mansion that once enslaved Chidinma became haunted with unpaid bills, threats from banks, and whispering neighbors. Still, Ngozi kept her head high. "We will rise again," she said. But behind the scenes, Chidinma was planning her entrance, not just to destroy them, but to reveal that the ghost they buried was the very storm that now owned their legacy. And this time, there would be no escape. Not for Obinna, and certainly not for the woman who tried to kill her twice. Chief Damien's death shook Lagos high society, not because he was particularly loved, but because he had been rich, connected, and respected. The headlines read, "Philanthropist and industrialist passes peacefully in sleep." His burial was announced within days, and the mansion turned into a ground of forced mourning. The compound was tented with white and gold canopies, and Ngozi, now a widow, played the role she had mastered, public saint. She wore soft lace, no makeup, and carried a Bible everywhere. She refused to eat in public, quoted scripture, and told every guest how God gives and God takes. But beneath the surface, she wasn't grieving. She was planning. Damien had died the way she wanted, quietly, without drama, without lawyers digging through wills. She ensured his last meals were laced with double doses of sedatives, enough to silence any suspicions. She wept over his casket, but in her room that night, she drank wine and whispered to herself, 2 down, 1 more to go. But death leaves shadows behind, and some shadows begin to speak. Chidinma, watching everything from afar, received Damien's autopsy through her legal contact. Though the report didn't outright say murder, it confirmed high concentrations of sedatives inconsistent with his prescription. Cause of death, acute respiratory failure triggered by overdose. It was enough. Combined with Aduak's toxicology and the train footage, Chidinma now had 3 pillars of proof, and a complete picture of a woman who had built her life through calculated eliminations. But what struck Chidinma the most wasn't just Ngozi's evil. It was her father's foolishness. He had let it happen. He had watched her suffer, ignored her cries, believed his wife's lies, and in the end, died in the arms of the same woman who had poisoned his home. That thought haunted Chidinma. Not because she missed him, she didn't, but because part of her had once prayed he would save her. And now he was dead, silently, like a fool. But even fools deserve to be buried with truth. So Chidinma instructed her lawyer to file an anonymous petition to the state coroner's office, requesting an inquest into Damien's death. Quietly, officially, while the widow was still dancing over the inheritance, the court summoned medical experts. Meanwhile, her team began preparing a press release and a full documentary featuring the train footage, witness testimonies, and audio evidence from former staff. Sandra had retrieved an old voicemail where Ngozi once bragged to a friend, "If that girl ever shows her face again, I'll finish what I started." The walls were closing in. But Chidinma wasn't ready to strike yet. First, she had one more scene to play. One final curtain. She would attend the company's memorial service for Chief Damien, not as the dead girl, but as the ghost they buried, now back from the grave. The memorial service for Chief Damien was held at the Eco Convention Center, a high-profile gathering for business moguls, political elites, and family friends. Cameramen roamed, ushers smiled, and portraits of Damien decorated every wall. Ngozi stood center stage, a picture of grace in her white lace gown, her head tied in a sober black scarf. She spoke emotionally about her late husband's dreams, how he loved his children equally, and how his vision must live on. Obinna wore a suit too tight for his swollen ego, seated beside her like a prince in mourning. No one suspected that by the time the event ended, their entire legacy would crumble. Chidinma arrived 30 minutes late, intentionally. The hall was already full. The crowd turned when the back doors opened, and in walked a tall, dark-skinned woman in an ivory suit, natural puff style high, heels clicking with measured grace. She carried no entourage. No cameras followed her, but her presence silenced the hall. She walked down the aisle like a queen with unfinished business. Ngozi's face froze. Her lips parted. Obinna blinked as if seeing a ghost. People whispered, "Who is that? She looks familiar. Isn't that?" The whispers grew louder as the woman stepped on stage and took the mic. Her voice echoed through the hall. Calm. Steady. "Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Chidinma Damien Okoye." The room gasped. One woman fainted. A cameraman dropped his lens. Ngozi stood there, shaking, her hand gripping the podium. "That's not possible," she murmured. But it was. "You buried me without a body," Chidinma said. "You mourned me while dancing in your bedroom. But I didn't die. I rose. And I came back. Not with pain, but with power." She played the train footage. Live. In front of everyone. Ngozi's push. Chidinma's fall. No audio, but enough evidence. Gasps filled the room again. Ngozi tried to snatch the mic. Chidinma stepped aside and said, "Let the whole world see who you really are." She didn't stop there. She projected the toxicology reports, the financial statements, the bank account screenshots showing fake charities, and audio recordings of Ngozi coaching Obinna on how to forge project contracts. "This is not just about me," she said. "It's about every person you've lied to, every person you've hurt, every naira you've stolen, and the lives you've ended." Ngozi collapsed to the floor, wailing. Obinna tried to run out, but was stopped by plainclothes officers at the door. The EFCC had arrived. Police were in the building. Everything was timed. Everything was coordinated. As Ngozi was carried out in handcuffs, Chidinma looked down at her. She leaned in slowly and whispered, "You should have finished the job properly." Then she stepped back, turned to the cameras, and said, "I am not the victim. I am the verdict." By the next morning, the entire country had seen the footage. TV stations played it on loop. Blogs exploded with articles titled, "Dead Girl Returns with Evidence Against Stepmother." Social media erupted. Hashtag Justice for Chidinma trended across Nigeria and the diaspora. Radio hosts analyzed the betrayal. Newspapers ran front-page stories with chilling headlines. Pushed off a train by her mother, but she lived. Ngozi became the most hated woman in the country overnight. Interviews with former staff revealed years of abuse, manipulation, and threats. Obinna's former classmates spoke about how he bragged about inheritance and power. The EFCC raided the mansion, seizing luxury cars, documents, and artwork. Ngozi, now in police custody, was denied bail. Her crying videos in the cell leaked, but no one pitied her. Even her church revoked her membership. The woman who once held prayer meetings was now begging God from behind iron bars. Chidinma refused all interviews. She released a single written statement. "Let justice speak. I have nothing to say to the woman who tried to kill me. The law will say it for me." She didn't show up to the press conferences. She didn't cry for cameras. Instead, she sat in her quiet apartment, her father's company now under new leadership, and watched the empire that was built on her suffering turn to dust. People tried to call her a hero, a survivor, an inspiration. But she rejected those labels. She hadn't come back for praise. She had come for justice. Silent, calculated, brutal. Her lawyer, Chuka, began preparing for court. The charges were multiple: attempted murder, financial fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Ngozi's trial date was set. Obinna's financial crimes were split into a separate case. The courtroom wouldn't just be about law, it would be a public exorcism. On the day of Ngozi's arraignment, protesters stood outside the court in solidarity with Chidinma. But inside, she remained composed. She wore simple white, no makeup, hair in a puff, the same hair Ngozi once mocked. As the judge read out the charges and the court clerk asked for her plea, Ngozi whispered, "Not guilty." The judge looked over his glasses. "We'll see about that." Chidinma sat at the back, her eyes cold, fixed. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She wasn't looking for remorse. She was there for one thing alone: to make sure the woman who buried her would never see daylight again. Because this was no longer a story about pain. It was a story about power reclaimed. The moment Ngozi was escorted into the holding cell at Kirikiri Women's Prison, reality began to settle like a stone in her chest. The cold floor, the cracked walls, the choking smell of sweat and iron. It was a far cry from the marble floors and Italian chandeliers of her Ikoyi mansion. No staff bowed at her arrival. No one offered her wine or wiped her tears. The wardens were blunt and unsympathetic. "Oya, madam, sit down there. You day cry like say now you dem push for train." Her designer wrapper was torn during arrest. Her wig had been removed. Her once perfect nails were chipped. She sat in the corner of the cell like a collapsed statue, legs folded under her, rocking gently, whispering prayers no one answered. Her fellow inmates, initially stunned, began whispering. "Now the woman wait kill her stepdaughter. I hear say she poisoned one maid too." One of them spat on the floor beside her. "She no go last here." Ngozi was no longer the queen. She was just another prisoner, stripped of power, of position, and of peace. The next day, she requested to speak to Chidinma. She was granted a 10-minute supervised visit, though her lawyer warned her not to expect a warm reception. She sat in the visitation booth, tears pouring down her face, rehearsing her apology. But when Chidinma walked in, she froze. The woman who entered was not the girl she pushed off a train. No. This was someone new, calm, elegant, and ice-cold. Dressed in an ivory suit, no earrings, and with her natural hair packed high. Chidinma sat down and looked straight through her. "I didn't mean to push you," Ngozi began. "You meant it," Chidinma interrupted, her voice low but sharp. "You looked me in the eye before you did it." Ngozi choked on her tears. "Please forgive me. Please talk to the press. Tell them it was an accident." Chidinma blinked slowly. "Why would I do that?" she asked. "So you can return to your mansion and throw your next mate off a bridge." Ngozi dropped to her knees, still separated by the glass. "I raised you," she whimpered. Chidinma leaned in. "You didn't raise me. You buried me." Then she stood up. "This is the last time you'll ever see me. Enjoy your prison uniform. It suits you more than lace." The visit ended. Ngozi collapsed in the booth, wailing as guards dragged her away. Meanwhile, Obinna, now under EFCC custody, was facing his own hell. His accounts were drained, his assets seized, his friends disappeared. No one wanted to be associated with the man whose mother had become a national disgrace. Even his girlfriend returned the car he bought for her, claiming bad energy. In detention, he sent multiple letters begging Chidinma for leniency. She tore each one without reading. She instructed her lawyer to treat him like any other criminal. "There will be no emotion in the courtroom," she said. "No sympathy. No soft voice." For the first time in years, she slept with peace in her lungs. Justice was no longer a dream. It was happening, and there would be no turning back. The courthouse was filled to the brim on the first day of the trial. News cameras lined the gates. Protesters gathered with placards that read, "Justice for Chidinma," and "Lock up the killer in lace." Inside, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. On one side sat Ngozi, dressed in a faded brown prison gown, eyes sunken, lips dry, her pride shattered. On the other side sat Chidinma, flanked by her legal team, calm and composed in all white. The courtroom fell into respectful silence as the judge entered. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the charges: attempted murder, obstruction of justice, and financial fraud. Ngozi's defense team tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming temporary psychosis from postmenopausal emotional instability. But the judge shut it down quickly. "We're not here for sentimental therapy. We're here for the truth." One by one, the witnesses came forward. A former housemaid testified that Ngozi had once threatened to kill Chidinma and make it look like an accident. The forensic toxicologist presented the lab report confirming the presence of poison in MMA Oduax, preserved hair. The pathologist reviewed the sedative overdose that caused Chief Damien's death. And then came the highlight, the train footage. The entire courtroom watched as Ngozi shoved Chidinma off the moving train. There was no sound, no debate. Just action, clear, deliberate, and damning. As the footage ended, Ngozi covered her face and cried. But the courtroom didn't pity her. Even the stenographer shook her head in disgust. Her lawyer tried to argue. There is no audio to prove she meant to kill. The judge raised his brow. Are you suggesting she wanted to bless her with fresh air mid-ride? Then it was Chidinma's turn to speak. She took the stand, looked the judge in the eye, and told her story. From the day her mother died, to the years of abuse, to the slap that dislocated her jaw, to the fake funeral, and the buried truth. Her voice didn't tremble. It soared. "She didn't just try to kill me," Chidinma said. "She killed my childhood, my faith in love, my belief that family meant safety." The court was silent. Even the judge put down his pen and listened. "But I came back," she continued, "not for revenge, but for every child being abused behind closed doors. I am not here as a victim. I am here as proof that pain doesn't have to be the end." The courtroom erupted in applause. and Ngozi buried her face in her hands, knowing, deep down, that her end had already been written. The prosecution saved its deadliest blow for the final day of argument. They presented a detailed timeline showing Ngozi's premeditated pattern. First, the calculated poisoning of MMA Uduak, who had threatened to expose her. Then, the pushing of Chidinma off the train. And finally, the slow sedation killing of Chief Damien, her own husband, whose only sin was loving the wrong woman and ignoring his daughter's pain. The judge was visibly disturbed. This wasn't an accident, the prosecutor thundered. This was a pattern of greed, power, and cold-hearted murder. If she hadn't been stopped, how many more would have been buried without a casket? The courtroom shuddered. Ngozi, pale and wordless, trembled in her chair. Her lawyer gave up trying to spin the story. The evidence was too strong. Her silence was now her only shield, and it was crumbling. Then Chidinma stood one last time. She looked straight at the judge and said, "She tried to kill me twice. The first time with her hands. The second time with silence." She paused. "When I survived, I thought about forgiving her. But how do you forgive someone who wouldn't even admit you were human?" Her voice cracked for the first time. "I was a child. I begged. I cried. I starved. I nearly died. And all she gave me was more pain." The judge nodded slowly. "Do you have a final request, Miss Okoye?" Chidinma looked over at Ngozi and said quietly, "Let her feel what it's like to be invisible, to sit behind bars and know the world has moved on, that her name now means nothing but shame." She stepped down from the witness box and didn't look back. As the courtroom prepared for final deliberation, Ngozi sat frozen. For the first time, she truly understood that she had lost. Not just in court, but in legacy, in family, in life. Her son was in prison. Her mansion was gone. Her reputation destroyed. And the girl she tried to erase was now the face of strength across the nation. Outside, children wore t-shirts that read, "You can't kill a girl who came back from a grave." NGOs began forming in Chidinma's name. Documentaries were pitched. But she accepted none of it. As she told her lawyer, "I didn't do this to be known. I did this so she'd be forgotten." And now, with judgment looming, the only thing left was the verdict, and the sound of a courtroom slamming shut on a woman who once thought she owned the world. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Even the walls felt tense, as though they, too, were waiting for justice. Reporters sat with cameras primed, pens poised. The judge returned from recess, his face unreadable. The room fell into total silence as he cleared his throat and began to read. After careful review of all evidence presented to this honorable court, including forensic proof of premeditated poisoning, security footage of attempted murder, financial crimes tied to abuse of power, and the personal testimony of the survivor, this court finds the defendant, Ngozi Damien, guilty on all counts. Gasps spread across the courtroom. Some wept. Some clapped silently. But Chidinma didn't move. She sat straight, eyes fixed ahead. Her hands were folded gently, but her jaw clenched. The judge paused, adjusted his glasses, then continued. "For the crimes of attempted murder and murder, this court hereby sentences the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Ngozi didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply slumped in her chair as if her bones had lost all strength. Her eyes scanned the room for pity, but there was none left. Obinna, seated in another dock awaiting his own fraud sentencing, looked away. No one from the family showed up. No pastor, no friend, no sympathizer. Her fall from grace was total. As guards approached to cuff her, she tried to stand, but her knees buckled. She reached out, instinctively, desperately, toward Chidinma. "Baiko." "Chidinma, you've made your point," she whispered. "Tell him to show me mercy." But Chidinma didn't flinch. She stood slowly, picked up her bag, and said, loud enough for the press to hear, "Mercy? The girl you threw off a train was 13. And she begged you. You didn't listen. I'm not God. But I'm not your savior either." And with that, she turned and walked out. No tears. No nods. No closure. Just finality. As Ngozi was dragged away, her screams echoed down the hallway. I was the mother. I was the wife. This is not my ending. But the world had moved on. Her story was no longer about elegance or marriage. It was about evil exposed and justice served. Outside the courthouse, crowds chanted, "Never again! Never again!" Cameras captured Chidinma's silent exit as she stepped into a black SUV and shut the door behind her. She didn't wave. She didn't grant interviews. Inside the car, she stared out the window as Lagos rolled past, bustling, chaotic, beautiful. The same city that once buried her was now witnessing her resurrection. But she didn't feel victorious. Not in the way people imagined. She felt clean. For the first time in her life, she didn't carry someone else's sin on her back. Ngozi was behind bars. And the door to that nightmare was finally closed forever. 3 months later, in a quiet village far from the noise of Lagos, Chidinma stood before a newly built bungalow with a ribbon in her hands. The building was painted soft cream, surrounded by a vegetable garden and mango trees. It was not a mansion. It was not marble. But it was peace. She turned to the old man beside her, Papa Ikenna, the deaf hunter who found her all those years ago. Tears glistened in his eyes as she handed him the keys. "For you and Mama Ifeoma," she said. "You gave me life when I had none. Now I'm giving you a home." The villagers gathered and applauded as Papa Ikenna hugged her tightly. She wept then, not from pain, but from gratitude. Here, she wasn't Dr. C.D. Okoye. She wasn't the girl who survived. She was just Chidinma, a soul reborn in silence and stitched back together by love. Later that evening, she sat on a woven mat under a tree, watching children play with stones and sticks. A little girl ran up to her, holding a flyer. "Auntie, is this you?" It was an old newspaper clipping. She came back from the grave to bury her stepmother. Chidinma smiled softly and folded the paper. "Yes, it was me. But that part is over." The girl sat beside her, wide-eyed. "Will you open a school?" Chidinma thought for a moment. "No," she said, "but I will build a tailoring center, a place for girls like me, to learn, to grow, to earn, to heal." And that was exactly what she did. Months later, the MMA Aduak Tailoring Institute opened its doors. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about clout. It was about legacy. Chidinma built a name not from pity, but from persistence. And yet, she never went back to the mansion in Ikoyi. She never reclaimed the house. She let it rot, abandoned and sealed by the courts. She didn't write a book. She didn't sign a documentary deal. She simply walked away. Because survival wasn't about telling the world what you endured. It was about reclaiming your silence and choosing what to do with your peace. On her 30th birthday, she stood by a river near Ominato village and whispered to the wind, "I didn't come back to haunt you, Ngozi. I came back to outlive you." And with that, she dropped the last piece of the past into the water, a faded train ticket from a decade ago. It floated for a moment, then disappeared, just like the girl who was once thrown off a train, only to rise and walk away stronger than ever. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.